"Ma'am, I need to verify your boarding pass again. Please step aside." The flight attendant didn't even meet her eyes as she spoke. At Denver International Airport, a well-dressed black woman approached the first-class counter with quiet confidence, pulling a sleek leather suitcase behind her. She offered a polite smile, the kind worn by people who've earned their place 1,000 times over, only to be challenged once more. That smile vanished the moment her ticket was questioned. Around her, other first-class passengers breezed through the gate with barely a glance, but she was stopped. What the airline staff didn't realize was that the woman they were sidelining, Danielle Hayes, was the CEO of Novamind Technologies, a powerhouse behind a multi-billion-dollar medical logistics empire. And unbeknownst to them, she was also the majority shareholder quietly evaluating their airline for a $3 billion global transport contract. In less than an hour, their mistake would become the costliest decision in the airline's history. Danielle Hayes wasn't just another executive traveling for business. She was the visionary force behind Novamind Technologies, a billion-dollar medical tech empire reshaping how hospitals deliver care. At just 39 years old, the Detroit-born CEO had built her company from the ground up, beginning with a salvaged laptop, evenings spent washing dishes, and sleepless nights teaching herself how to code. By the time she graduated from the University of Michigan, she had already launched her first diagnostic platform. Danielle was known in the tech world as sharp, discreet, and deeply intentional, a leader who never sent others to do work she wasn't willing to do herself. That's why, when Novamind began vetting global airlines for a multi-billion-dollar partnership to handle logistics for its hospital partners, Danielle chose to fly incognito, experiencing each company's service firsthand. Her current trip was critical. She was on her way to Tokyo to finalize a $500 million AI hospital partnership, and she'd booked a first-class ticket on Sierra Pacific Airlines, a legacy carrier with a long history, now struggling to compete for relevance and profit. What they didn't know was that Novamind's upcoming transport contract, worth $3 billion over 5 years, could single-handedly reshape Sierra Pacific's future. Danielle's quiet presence at the Denver International Airport wasn't just another traveler in a tailored coat and leather flats. She was the final evaluator in a high-stakes deal. But none of that mattered when bias entered the equation. Despite her confirmed first-class reservation and elite frequent flyer status, Danielle was stopped at the gate. A gate agent barely glanced at her boarding pass before insisting it required further verification. Moments later, she was pulled aside for a random security screening, subjected to invasive questioning about her ticket, her payment method, and even her company's authorization for travel expenses. Questions none of the white businessmen in the same line were asked. As her plane continued boarding, Danielle stood calmly, submitting the same documents again and again, while gate staff whispered behind the counter and passengers started. When she requested to see the seating manifest, simply to confirm she hadn't lost her place, she was denied. "That information isn't available to passengers like you," one supervisor told her, a phrase that clung in the air like smoke. And so, as the final boarding call was announced and the jet bridge door closed, Danielle remained grounded, not because she was late, not because of any security risk, but because of the assumptions made about who belonged in first class and who didn't. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a defining moment. And for Sierra Pacific Airlines, it would soon become a mistake that cost them everything. Danielle remained composed as she calmly requested the gate agent to recheck her boarding pass, but her professionalism was met with a sneer and a dismissive reply. "First class isn't for passengers who don't meet certain qualifications." The implication was loud, clear, and deeply insulting. Instead of simply verifying her credentials like any other traveler, the staff demanded a company letter of authorization, a printed itinerary, and a personal credit card, even though she'd already presented a digital ticket purchased through a corporate account. When she politely asked to see the seating manifest, a supervisor leaned over the counter and, without even glancing at her, muttered, "That's not information available to passengers like you." The phrase sliced through the air, triggering a few heads to turn. Around her, other first-class passengers continued boarding unbothered. White men in suits, chatting with attendants or sipping coffee from the lounge. But Danielle stood alone, her presence becoming an increasingly uncomfortable spectacle. A few bystanders began recording the interaction on their phones, sensing something wasn't right, but no one intervened. Even as the gate area grew tense, Danielle refused to raise her voice. She knew how fast black women in public spaces could be recast from professional to aggressive. Instead, she asked, again, for clarification. The staff responded with silence, side eyes, and eventually a call to airport security. When the officer arrived, he didn't ask questions. He just reached for her arm, directing her toward a nearby customer service desk with visible force. Danielle's leather carry-on slipped from her shoulder. She adjusted it, straightened her blazer, and said nothing. But just as the officer tightened his grip, her phone rang. The name flashing on the screen. Brian Tanaka, her chief strategy officer. She answered instantly, her voice steady despite the storm unfolding around her. "Brian, I need a quick update." On the other end, Brian's voice was sharp and urgent. "We have a problem," he began. "Sierra Pacific isn't just failing the service audit. They're exposing themselves to massive liability. And you're being detained." Danielle's silence confirmed it. What the staff around her didn't know, and what the rest of the terminal was about to learn, was that the woman they had just humiliated was not only Sierra Pacific's largest indirect shareholder through Horizon Equity Fund, but also the final decision-maker in a $3 billion contract that could make or break the airline's future. Brian continued, "Should I initiate the trigger?" Danielle looked around the terminal, people watching, phones up, murmurs spreading, and replied softly, "Yes. Execute Plan Delta." That single call, made in the shadow of a gate that had closed her out, would spark a chain of events that no airline PR department could spin and no executive apology could undo. Within minutes, what started as prejudice at the boarding gate would ignite a reckoning felt across boardrooms, newsrooms, and Wall Street. As Danielle listened to Brian's voice on the other end of the line, the full weight of the situation crystallized. "Danielle," he said, "through Horizon Equity, we now hold 26% of Sierra Pacific Airlines' outstanding shares. You're not just a passenger, they're humiliating their largest stakeholder." The revelation was sobering, but it wasn't news to Danielle. This flight had been part of a larger, carefully orchestrated plan. Disguised as a routine business trip, she was quietly conducting a first-hand service audit, an unannounced evaluation of Sierra Pacific's premium customer experience. The results would determine whether they were awarded Novamind's upcoming global medical logistics contract, a $3 billion deal spanning 5 years and 38 hospital partners. But now, this wasn't just a failed service test, it was a clear case of discriminatory conduct from an airline already under scrutiny for similar behavior. Danielle's calm demeanor didn't break, but her mind was already 10 steps ahead. "Start pulling the compliance documents," she told Brian. "We'll activate our emergency voting rights and demand a board meeting within 24 hours. As she paced near the customer service desk, she issued rapid-fire instructions. Her legal counsel was to draft a notice of internal policy violations and prepare shareholder motions. Her PR director was to begin crafting talking points and monitor social sentiment. Then came the final directive. Compile every discrimination-related complaint against Sierra Pacific in the last 5 years, filed or buried. Within minutes, her communications team began coordinating an encrypted live stream of the incident, which had already begun going viral thanks to passenger-recorded videos. Danielle didn't need theatrics. She needed facts, leverage, and precision, and that's exactly what she was mobilizing. Quietly, she reached out to 2 financial analysts at Bloomberg and Forbes, feeding them anonymous tips about potential shareholder unrest and compliance risks within Sierra Pacific's executive branch. The intent wasn't to destroy the company, it was to expose the culture it had allowed to fester. Sierra Pacific's own bylaws stated that any shareholder with more than 25% equity could trigger an emergency governance review. Danielle had 26%. She could call for leadership changes, initiate a vote of no confidence, and even motion for a temporary freeze in operations pending an ethics investigation. And that's exactly what she planned to do. Around her, the airport moved on, unaware that the woman they had just pushed to the side was preparing to tilt an entire airline's future on its axis. What had begun as a subtle humiliation had transformed into a strategic response, one rooted not in revenge but in accountability. Danielle wasn't seeking headlines, she was seeking a reckoning. And with every call, every document drafted, and every camera now watching, that reckoning was no longer a distant possibility. It was inevitable. Danielle stepped up onto a nearby bench in the center of Terminal B, her posture poised, her expression unwavering. The hum of airport noise dulled to a murmur as people turned to watch, phones already raised, live streams flickering to life. "My name is Danielle Hayes," she announced, her voice clear, calm, and unmistakably authoritative. "I am the CEO of Nova Mind Technologies, and I've just been denied the right to board my first-class flight. Not because of a policy, not because of a mistake, but because of what I look like." The words echoed through the terminal, and in an instant the air changed. Gate agents froze mid-motion. Supervisors who had once spoken with smug superiority now paled. Passengers, some who had dismissed the earlier conflict as routine, were now glued to the scene, shocked into silence. Reporters who had been tipped off began pushing their way forward, cameras in hand, capturing every second. But Danielle wasn't finished. She reached into her leather tote and pulled out a small folder, handing it to her assistant, who distributed copies to the media gathered nearby. "Here are records of over 60 formal complaints filed against Sierra Pacific Airlines in the last 6 years. Complaints involving racial profiling, denial of service, and discriminatory seating reassignments. Every single one was either dismissed without follow-up or quietly settled out of court." Gasps rippled through the crowd as she tapped her phone and projected audio files, recordings from passengers who had been humiliated, silenced, and ignored. "I'm not just here as a customer," she continued. "I'm here as a decision-maker. Nova Mind has been evaluating Sierra Pacific for a global logistics contract valued at over $3 billion. As of this moment, Sierra Pacific is no longer under consideration. We are transferring all contract discussions to its leading competitor, Luminary Air." That single declaration sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd. People looked at one another, stunned by the weight of what was happening. Not just a public call-out, but the unraveling of a corporate partnership in real time. Her voice did not waver. "Furthermore, as the majority shareholder through Horizon Equity Fund, I am initiating an emergency motion to suspend operations until a full internal audit and executive review are completed." Airport security approached her cautiously, but this time not to remove her. They knew now exactly who she was. Cameras from CNN, CNBC, and local news affiliates were trained on her, capturing every syllable, every revelation. Employees from Sierra Pacific stood stiffly behind counters, their earlier arrogance replaced with visible fear. Danielle lowered her voice, but her tone grew even more powerful. "This is not just about one boarding pass. This is about patterns, patterns of exclusion, of disrespect, of ignoring the humanity of your passengers. You've trained your staff to look at people like me and see a threat, not a customer. But what you failed to see was the consequence of that assumption." Behind her, her legal team handed documents to members of the press. Emails from within the company, dismissing discrimination concerns, internal memos that described profiling protocols disguised as customer safety measures. It was damning, irrefutable, and for Sierra Pacific, it was the beginning of the end. Danielle stepped down from the bench and walked calmly back toward the center of the terminal, trailed by her staff and cameras. She didn't have to raise her voice to burn the entire structure down. Truth had already lit the match. Within 2 hours of Danielle's public declaration in Terminal B, Sierra Pacific Airlines stock began to plummet. Traders on Wall Street watched in disbelief as the airline's value dropped by over 27% before midday, triggering automatic sell orders and flooding financial news channels with breaking alerts. The airline's board of directors convened an emergency session via video call from their headquarters in San Francisco, with several members already en route to Denver for damage control. The CEO, Alan Groves, a legacy executive who had inherited his role through generational industry ties, was summoned immediately. When Danielle entered the private boardroom inside the airport's executive suite, the atmosphere was brittle. Some directors tried to offer explanations. Others avoided eye contact altogether. But Danielle didn't come for apologies. She came for accountability. With calm precision, she laid out a timeline of what had occurred. supported by recordings, witness statements, legal memos, and 6 years' worth of ignored complaints. "You knew," she said without raising her voice. "You were warned, and you chose to look away." One of the board members asked if there was any way to salvage the partnership with Novamind. Danielle's response was swift. "This was never just about Novamind. This is about every passenger you've treated as invisible. The price of that disregard is now due." Facing mounting pressure and public outrage, the board unanimously voted to accept Alan Grove's immediate resignation. He exited the room with a blank expression, his career collapsing under the weight of a culture he had upheld. In the same meeting, the board approved a temporary 90-day suspension of all Sierra Pacific operations, marking the first voluntary shutdown of a major U.S. airline not caused by financial insolvency or mechanical failure, but by systemic misconduct. All flights were grounded, planes were rerouted to return home, terminals emptied as operations ceased. But Danielle declined personal compensation. When offered a multi-million-dollar settlement and exclusive travel privileges, she refused. "This isn't about me flying first class," she said. "This is about building a system where no one has to prove they belong." Instead, she proposed the establishment of the Airfare Initiative, a non-profit legal fund designed to support travelers who experience discrimination within the airline industry. The fund would offer legal aid, public advocacy, and education for both customers and employees on implicit bias and equity in service. The board approved the motion unanimously, pledging $25 million in seed funding and committing to ongoing audits of their hiring and training practices. Danielle's final request was simple but firm: an independent external audit of every Sierra Pacific division, human resources, customer service, in-flight operations, and the public release of its findings. "Real reform doesn't happen behind closed doors," she said. "It happens when you stop hiding the truth and start rebuilding with it." Outside the boardroom, news of the shutdown went viral. Hashtags like #Airline Accountability and #Danielle Hayes trends globally. Financial analysts called it a wake-up call for corporate America. For Danielle, it wasn't a victory lap. It was the beginning of a larger mission, transforming an industry that had too long equated luxury with exclusion and professionalism with whiteness. The reckoning had come, not with protests or lawsuits alone, but with one woman refusing to be quietly humiliated, and choosing instead to hold the system to its highest standards. 2 months later, Danielle Hayes stood on the TEDx stage in New York, dressed in the same understated style she was known for: black slacks, a crisp blouse, and a quiet strength that needed no introduction. She didn't recount the now infamous incident at Terminal B. The world already knew that story. Instead, she simply looked out at the crowd, paused, and said, "They told me I didn't belong in first class. But I don't need anyone's permission to belong. I redesigned the gate so that people like me would never again have to ask whether they're worthy." The audience sat in rapt silence, not just listening, but absorbing the weight of her presence, the history behind it, and the message embedded within her quiet authority. What had begun as a single discriminatory interaction had evolved into a national conversation about systemic bias in one of the country's most public industries. Airports, those supposed symbols of freedom and access, had been exposed as gatekeepers for assumptions, classism, and racial profiling. And Danielle, without shouting or demanding sympathy, had held up a mirror to an entire sector and forced it to look. The lesson from her story was not one of vengeance, but of transformation. In a world where systems often decide who's qualified or deserving based on zip code, skin color, accent, or hairstyle, real power doesn't come from yelling louder. It comes from refusing to step back. It comes from understanding the machinery behind injustice and having the courage and clarity to dismantle it piece by piece. Danielle didn't fight the airline with fists or fury. She fought it with facts, law, economic leverage, and an unshakable belief in her own worth. That belief didn't just restore her seat on a plane, it realigned the direction of an entire airline and forced an industry-wide reckoning that echoed far beyond Denver. Her refusal to internalize someone else's perception of her value became the catalyst for policy reform, leadership resignations, and the creation of a legal support fund for countless others who had experienced the same silent, normalized abuse. For anyone who's ever been told, through words, gestures, or corporate policies, that they don't belong, let Danielle's story be a reminder. You are not invisible. You are not powerless. Systems are built, but they can also be unbuilt. Your voice doesn't have to be the loudest to be the strongest. Sometimes, the most disruptive thing you can do is stand your ground with unwavering dignity. The next time you are asked to step aside, remember that it only takes one moment, one decision, one voice, one call to turn exclusion into revolution. You don't need to prove your worth to those who refuse to see it. You need only to know it, hold it, and use it to build something better than what came before. Because when one person rises with purpose, the ground shifts beneath all of us. And in that shift, there's room for others to rise too. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that dignity is not something granted, but something owned, then don't keep it to yourself. At X Daily Stories, we bring you powerful, true-to-life narratives that challenge injustice, celebrate courage, and spark change. Subscribe now to never miss a story that just might shift the way you see the world. New episodes every day, because every day someone dares to speak up, stand tall, and rewrite the rules. This is X Daily Stories, where voices rise and systems fall.